The auditorium lights dimmed as the processional music swelled through the speakers, and I adjusted the emerald green hood draped over my shoulders. Around me, 200 graduates shifted in their seats, whispering final words of encouragement to one another before we'd be called to cross that stage. My hands were damp against the program in my lap, and I kept glancing toward the entrance where families were still trickling in, filling the rows that curved around the hall like an embrace. I'd reserved 4 seats in the third row, close enough to see faces clearly, close enough to catch a smile or a wave. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The tickets had arrived months ago, embossed with gold lettering, and I'd mailed them to Portland with a handwritten note reminding everyone of the date and time. My mother had replied with a single text confirming receipt. No words of pride, no acknowledgement of what those 2 years of late nights and relentless workload had cost me. Just a thumbs-up emoji that I'd stared at for far too long, trying to extract meaning from its casual indifference. The seats remained empty as the dean stepped to the podium and began her opening remarks about resilience and innovation. I told myself they were just running late, caught in traffic on Interstate 5 or delayed at a rest stop. My father hated rushing, always insisting on arriving exactly on time, never early, as if punctuality were a mark of superiority rather than respect. But as the first names were called and graduates began their walk across the stage, the empty chairs seemed to grow larger, more conspicuous, a glaring absence that felt louder than any applause. When the dean called my name, Maya Torres, Master of Business Administration with a concentration in sustainable business, I rose and walked toward the stage with my shoulders back and my chin lifted, refusing to let the hollow ache in my chest show on my face. The photographer directed me to turn slightly to the left, to hold the diploma folder higher, and I complied with a practiced smile that felt like a mask I'd worn too many times before. The flash went off, the handshake was firm and brief, and then I was walking back down the stairs, returning to my seat among strangers who clapped politely because that's what you do at graduations, not because they knew me or cared about what I'd accomplished. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I sat down, and for a fleeting moment, hope flickered that maybe they'd sent a message explaining their absence, that maybe there was a reasonable explanation waiting for me. I pulled it out carefully, shielding the screen from the person beside me, and saw a notification from my mother. The preview showed a photo, bright and sunlit, and when I opened it fully, I saw my sister Sienna standing on a white sand beach, her arms stretched wide, turquoise water sparkling behind her. The caption read, "Paradise found. Best family vacation ever." My father was in the background, reclined on a lounge chair with a drink in hand, and my mother's reflection appeared in Sienna's sunglasses as she snapped the selfie. They were in Hawaii. Not stuck in traffic. Not delayed by an emergency. They had chosen a vacation over my graduation, and they hadn't even bothered to tell me beforehand. The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket, my hands trembling slightly as I forced myself to focus on the remaining ceremony. Around me, families cheered as names were called, children waved small flags, and cameras clicked incessantly, documenting joy and pride in a way that felt foreign to me. I'd always known I was different in my family's eyes, that my achievements were footnotes in a story where Sienna was the protagonist, but this felt like a new low, a confirmation that I had never mattered enough to warrant their presence at something so significant. The ceremony dragged on for another 40 minutes, each moment stretching like taffy, sticky and endless, until finally the dean announced the graduating class and invited everyone to celebrate. I stood with the others, tossing my cap into the air in a gesture that felt hollow, then gathered my things and made my way toward the exit. Outside, the California sun was relentless, beating down on the stone plaza where families clustered in tight groups, taking photos and exchanging congratulations. I walked quickly, head down, trying to blend into the crowd and avoid eye contact with anyone who might ask where my family was. My car was parked 3 blocks away, and the walk gave me time to think, to process what had just happened and what it meant for the fragile thread of connection I still held to my parents and sister. They'd missed plenty of milestones before, always with excuses that sounded reasonable in the moment but never quite added up when you looked at the pattern. My 18th birthday had fallen on a weekend when Sienna wanted to visit Disneyland, and my parents had surprised her with tickets and a hotel stay, leaving me at home with a grocery store cake and a card signed by all three of them in the same handwriting. When I'd been accepted into UC Berkeley for my undergraduate degree in environmental science, they'd been at a professional photo shoot for Sienna's modeling portfolio, something she'd been trying to launch for months without any real success. And when I'd made the dean's list for 3 consecutive semesters, my mother had shrugged and said it was just a certificate, nothing worth making a fuss over. But this was different. A graduation wasn't just another achievement to downplay. It represented 2 years of sacrifice, of working full-time while attending classes at night, of skipping social events and weekends to study for exams and complete group projects. I'd taken out loans to cover tuition because my parents had made it clear early on that financial support was reserved for Sienna's endeavors, whatever those might be at any given moment. They'd paid for her apartment in Portland when she decided to pursue real estate, covering her rent for a full year while she built her client base. They'd funded her wardrobe, her car, her vacations, all under the guise of helping her establish herself. Meanwhile, I'd been told that I needed to be self-sufficient, that handouts would only make me weak and entitled. My father's favorite phrase echoed in my mind as I reached my car, unlocking it and sliding into the driver's seat. "Stand on your own 2 feet, Maya. Nobody's going to carry you through life." I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, replaying every missed moment and every dismissive comment, trying to pinpoint when I'd stopped mattering to them. Maybe it had always been this way, and I'd just been too hopeful to see it clearly. Sienna had been born 3 years after me, during a time when my parents' marriage had been strained and their finances uncertain. Her arrival had somehow become a reset button, a second chance to do things right, and they'd poured all their energy and resources into making sure she had every opportunity they felt they denied me. I'd been the practice run, the trial version, and she was the polished final product. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but fairness had never been a currency my family dealt in. My phone buzzed again and I pulled it out, half expecting another beach photo or a breezy message about how wonderful Hawaii was. Instead, it was a text from my Aunt Lucia, my mother's younger sister who'd always been kind to me in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory. She'd sent a simple message asking how the ceremony went, and whether I'd celebrated with friends afterward. I typed out a brief reply, thanking her for remembering and telling her it had gone well, omitting the part about my family's absence because I didn't want to burden her with the truth. She responded immediately, saying she was proud of me and that she'd love to take me to dinner sometime soon to celebrate properly. Her words were a small balm on a raw wound, and I held on to them as I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. The drive back to my apartment in Sacramento took an hour, the highway stretching out before me in a blur of heat and asphalt. I played music loudly, letting the bass drown out my thoughts, but by the time I reached my exit, the anger had begun to settle in, replacing the hurt with something sharper and more focused. I parked in my assigned spot and climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, unlocking the door and stepping into the cool dimness of my living room. The space was small but tidy, decorated with second-hand furniture I'd refinished myself and plants I'd nurtured from cuttings. It was mine, earned through my own effort, and that fact had always been a source of pride. But today it felt lonely, a reminder that I'd built this life entirely on my own because no one else had cared enough to help. I changed out of my graduation gown and into comfortable clothes, then made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, scrolling absently through social media. Sienna's Instagram was full of updates from Hawaii, each post garnering hundreds of likes and comments from friends and strangers alike. She'd tagged the resort, a luxury property that charged upwards of $500 per night, and included hashtags like blessed and family time and living my best life. The comments were effusive, people congratulating her on the trip and telling her she deserved it. I wondered what they'd think if they knew the cost of that vacation, not just in dollars but in the message it sent to the daughter who'd been left behind. 2 days passed in a haze of routine. I went to work at the green energy startup where I'd been employed for the past year, sitting through meetings and responding to emails with a focus that felt mechanical. My colleagues asked about graduation, and I told them it had been nice, deflecting follow-up questions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story, with vague statements about being glad it was over. At night, I returned to my apartment and tried to distract myself with books and television, But my mind kept circling back to the empty seats and the beach photo and the growing realization that I needed to accept my family for who they were rather than who I wished they would be. On the third day, as I was finishing lunch at my desk, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The area code was local, somewhere in Northern California, and I answered with a cautious hello, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. Instead, a deep voice greeted me, steady and professional, introducing himself as Vincent Marsh, an attorney representing the estate of Robert and Margaret Calloway. The names hit me like a wave, pulling me under with memories I'd kept carefully tucked away. My grandparents. I hadn't heard their names spoken aloud in months, not since the quiet memorial service I'd organized last winter after they'd passed within weeks of each other. They'd been in their late 80s, their health declining gradually until it had seemed almost peaceful when they'd finally let go. Vincent continued speaking, his words measured and deliberate, explaining that he'd been handling the settlement of their estate and that there were matters requiring my immediate attention. He asked if I could meet with him in San Francisco later that week, and I agreed without hesitation, my curiosity overriding any hesitation. We set a time for Friday afternoon, and he gave me the address of his office before ending the call with a polite reminder to bring identification. I sat at my desk for several minutes afterward, staring at the phone in my hand, wondering what this could possibly be about. My grandparents had lived modestly in a small coastal town called Redwood Crest, their home a craftsman-style house with a rose garden and a view of the Pacific. I'd visited them regularly during high school and college, spending weekends helping with chores and listening to their stories about the years they'd spent building a life together. My parents in Siena had rarely made the trip, usually only showing up for holidays or when they needed a backdrop for family photos. Friday arrived, and I drove to San Francisco early, navigating the congested streets until I found the building where Vincent's office was located. The lobby was sleek and modern, all glass and polished steel, and I took the elevator to the 14th floor, my heart beating faster with each passing second. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to a conference room where Vincent was waiting, a man in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor that radiated competence. He shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit, then opened a thick folder and began explaining the details of my grandparents' estate. What he told me next changed everything. My grandparents had left their entire estate to me, naming me as the sole beneficiary in a will they'd updated 2 years prior. The estate included the house in Redwood Crest, along with investment accounts and savings that totaled approximately $1.2 million. Vincent explained that they'd been very specific in their instructions, stating clearly that they wanted their assets to go to the grandchild, who had shown them consistent love and care. He slid a copy of the will across the table, and I read the words in my grandmother's handwriting, a codicil she'd added explaining their decision. Maya has been our light in the difficult years. She has given us her time and her heart without expecting anything in return. We trust her to honor our memory and use these resources wisely. I read the words 3 times, my vision blurring slightly as tears gathered at the corners of my eyes. My grandmother's cursive was shaky but deliberate, each letter formed with care despite the arthritis that had plagued her hands in her final years. The weight of their choice settled over me, not as a burden but as a validation I hadn't realized I'd been desperately seeking. They had seen me. They had valued what I'd given freely, the Saturday mornings spent weeding their garden, the afternoons fixing leaky faucets and replacing burnt-out light bulbs, the evenings sitting on their porch swing listening to stories about their youth. Those moments hadn't been transactions or obligations. They'd been genuine connections, built slowly over years when no one else in my family had bothered to make the drive. Vincent waited patiently as I absorbed the information, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When I finally looked up, he continued with the practical details. The house was fully paid off, the property taxes current, and the investment accounts were held in stable funds that had grown steadily over the decades. He explained that the transfer process would take several weeks, involving paperwork with the county recorder's office and coordination with the financial institutions where my grandparents had maintained their accounts. I would need to decide whether to keep the house or sell it, whether to maintain the investments as they were or restructure them according to my own financial goals. He recommended I take time to think through these decisions carefully, perhaps consult with a financial advisor, and avoid making any hasty choices driven by emotion. As he spoke, a different thought began forming in my mind, something darker and more pragmatic than grief or gratitude. I knew my family well enough to predict exactly what would happen once they learned about this inheritance. My parents would immediately assume they had some claim to it, that the money and property should be shared among all of us because that's what family does. Sienna would whip out her real estate expertise, suggesting we sell the house quickly and split the proceeds, probably pushing for a listing that benefited her professionally. They would frame it as fairness, as honoring my grandparents' memory by keeping everything equal, conveniently ignoring the fact that equality had never applied when it came to their treatment of me. And if I resisted, if I dared to claim what had been legally and intentionally left to me alone, they would turn it into a war of attrition, wearing me down with guilt and manipulation until I surrendered just to make the conflict stop. I couldn't let that happen. This inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was my grandparents' final statement about who had mattered to them, who had earned their trust and their love. Giving any of it away would betray that trust, would reduce their thoughtful decision to appeasement of people who hadn't deserved their consideration. But I also understood that simply owning the assets in my name wouldn't be enough protection. My parents were resourceful when they wanted something, and they had connections through Sienna's real estate work that could potentially create complications. I needed something more secure, something that would put the inheritance beyond their reach legally and permanently. Vincent must have noticed the shift in my expression because he leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Is there something specific you're concerned about, Maya?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but then decided that honesty was necessary if I wanted proper guidance. I told him about my family, about the pattern of neglect and favoritism that had defined my entire life. I explained how they'd missed my graduation for a vacation, how they'd funded Sienna's every whim while leaving me to struggle alone, how they'd never once acknowledged my grandparents' existence except when it served their purposes. And I told him what I feared would happen once they discovered I'd inherited everything, how they'd pressure me to share or find ways to contest the will or make my life miserable until I gave in. Vincent listened without interrupting, his face remaining neutral but his eyes showing a flicker of understanding. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, clearly considering his response. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "If you want absolute protection, there's a legal structure we can use called an irrevocable trust. It's more restrictive than other options, but it's also the most secure. Once assets are transferred into an irrevocable trust, they're no longer considered part of your personal estate. You can serve as the trustee, managing everything and making decisions about how the assets are used, but the trust itself owns them. That means they're shielded from creditors, lawsuits, and family disputes. Even if someone tried to challenge the arrangement, they'd have no legal standing because the assets aren't yours to give away or divide." The word irrevocable hung in the air between us, heavy with finality. Vincent explained the implications carefully. Once the trust was established and the assets transferred, I couldn't simply change my mind and pull everything back into my personal name. The structure was designed to be permanent, offering maximum protection precisely because it couldn't be easily undone. I would retain control as trustee, able to live in the house, manage the investments, and use the resources as I saw fit, but the underlying ownership would belong to the trust entity. It was a shield, impenetrable and absolute, and it was exactly what I needed. I asked about the timeline, the cost, the specific steps involved. Vincent outlined the process with the same methodical precision he'd shown throughout our meeting. We would need to draft the trust documents, which would take about a week. Then we'd establish a limited liability company owned by the trust, and transfer the house title into that LLC's name. The investment accounts would be closed and reopened under the trust's control, with dual authorization required for any major transactions. All of this needed to happen before the public transfer of the estate was finalized, essentially creating a secondary layer of ownership that wouldn't appear in the initial probate records. It was complex, deliberately so, designed to make the assets as difficult as possible to trace or challenge. The cost wasn't insignificant, several $1,000s in legal fees, but it was a fraction of what I stood to lose if my family managed to manipulate or coerce me into giving them access. Vincent assured me his firm had handled similar situations before, cases where family dynamics necessitated extraordinary protective measures. He didn't judge me for taking these steps. If anything, his tone suggested he respected the foresight, the willingness to prioritize security over sentiment. We scheduled another meeting for the following week to review the initial trust documents, and I left his office feeling something I hadn't experienced in a long time. A sense of control, of agency, of being several steps ahead rather than constantly scrambling to catch up. The drive back to Sacramento felt different, lighter somehow despite the seriousness of what I'd set in motion. I stopped at a coffee shop near my apartment and sat by the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk, each absorbed in their own concerns and complications. I thought about my grandparents, about the countless small kindnesses they'd shown me over the years. My grandfather teaching me how to identify different types of trees during walks through the woods behind their house. My grandmother letting me help bake pies every Sunday, patiently correcting my technique when I rolled the dough too thin or forgot to vent the top crust. They'd never made me feel like I was less than Sienna, never compared us or suggested I should be more like her. In their eyes, I'd been enough exactly as I was, and that acceptance had been a refuge I'd clung to during the worst periods of feeling invisible in my own family. Over the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into the process of securing the inheritance with a focus that bordered on obsessive. I met with Vincent twice more, reviewing every clause and provision in the trust documents, asking questions until I understood exactly how each piece functioned. We established the LLC under a neutral name, Pinehaven Holdings, deliberately bland and forgettable. The house title was transferred on a Tuesday afternoon, the county recorder stamping the documents without ceremony or fanfare. The investment accounts took longer, requiring signatures and verification from multiple institutions, but eventually those two were consolidated under the trust's control. Vincent set up a secure online portal where I could monitor everything, track transactions, and access documents without needing to keep physical copies that might be found or stolen. I told no one what I was doing. My colleagues at work assumed I was distracted by grief, and I let them believe it. My Aunt Lucia called once to check in, and I kept the conversation brief, mentioning that I was handling some paperwork related to my grandparents' affairs but offering no details. Sienna posted more vacation photos, this time from a weekend trip to wine country that my parents had apparently funded as an extension of their Hawaii generosity. I scrolled past the images without reacting, my anger now channeled into something productive rather than destructive. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment with a glass of wine and my laptop open, I found myself questioning whether I was being too harsh, too preemptive. Maybe my family would surprise me. Maybe they'd respect my grandparents' wishes and accept that the inheritance was mine alone. Maybe I was building walls against a threat that would never materialize. But then I opened my photo gallery and scrolled back to the picture Sienna had sent on my graduation day, the beach selfie with its caption about the best family vacation ever. I remembered the empty seats in the auditorium, the hollow applause from strangers, the drive home alone with tears I'd refused to let fall. And I knew I wasn't being harsh. I was being realistic, protecting myself from people who had proven repeatedly that I ranked last in their priorities. The final piece fell into place on a Thursday morning when Vincent called to confirm that all transfers were complete, and the trust was fully operational. He sent me a summary document, 12 pages outlining every asset, every account number, every protective provision. I printed it out and placed it in a fireproof safe I'd purchased specifically for this purpose, then made a digital copy that I stored in an encrypted cloud account with a password only I knew. The original documents remained in Vincent's office vault, and a second set went into a safe deposit box I'd rented at a bank in Oakland, far enough from Sacramento that no one in my immediate circle would think to look there. I felt like a general preparing for a siege, stockpiling resources and fortifying defenses against an enemy that hadn't yet declared war. But the war was coming. I could feel it in the careful way my mother had started texting more frequently, asking casual questions about how I was coping with the loss of my grandparents. I could see it in the sudden interest Sienna showed in Redwood Crest, mentioning she'd always loved that town and wondering if I'd been back to visit the house. They were circling, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to make their move. And when that moment came, I would be ready. The house itself became my sanctuary during this period. I drove up to Redwood Crest most weekends, ostensibly to sort through my grandparents' belongings but really just to be in the space they'd created. The rose garden was overgrown, blooms heavy on thorny stems that scraped against the fence. I spent hours pruning and weeding, my hands blistering despite the gloves I wore, finding a strange peace in the repetitive physical labor. Inside, the room still smelled faintly of my grandmother's lavender sachets and my grandfather's pipe tobacco, scents that triggered memories so vivid they felt like visitations. I sorted through closets and drawers slowly, keeping items that held meaning and donating the rest to local charities. Each piece I touched felt like a conversation with them, a chance to say thank you for seeing me when no one else did. I also began making small improvements to the property, things my grandparents had wanted to do but never had the energy or resources to complete. I hired a contractor to repair the sagging gutter along the back of the house. I replaced the cracked tiles in the kitchen backsplash with a pattern my grandmother had admired in a magazine years ago. I refinished the porch swing where we'd spent so many evenings, sanding away the weathered gray to reveal the honey-colored wood beneath. These weren't just repairs. They were promises, commitments to honoring the home they'd loved and ensuring it remained cared for the way they'd cared for me. During one of these weekend trips, my phone rang while I was kneeling in the garden, my hands deep in soil. I considered ignoring it, but the name on the screen made me pause. My mother. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered, keeping my voice neutral. She opened with pleasantries, asking about my job and whether I'd been eating well, the kind of surface-level concern that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Then she transitioned smoothly into the real reason for her call. Your father and I were talking, and we realized we never got a chance to properly discuss your grandparents' estate. We know they left you in charge of things and we wanted to offer our help. Estate matters can be complicated, and we don't want you to feel overwhelmed. The phrasing was careful, designed to sound supportive while planting the seed that I was incapable of handling this alone. I responded with equal care, thanking her for the concern but assuring her that I had everything under control. She pressed gently, asking if I'd met with their attorney yet, whether the house needed repairs, if there were debts to settle. Each question was a probe, testing how much information I'd volunteer. I gave her nothing concrete, just vague reassurances that everything was being handled properly. The conversation ended after 10 minutes, and I sat back on my heels, staring at the roses, knowing this was just the opening move. Sienna came next, showing up unannounced one Saturday afternoon, while I was painting the front door. She pulled into the driveway in her leased Mercedes, stepping out in designer athleisure and oversized sunglasses, her phone already out to document her visit. She hugged me like we were close, like she hadn't ignored me for months, and immediately began complimenting the house. This place is amazing, Maya. I can't believe I haven't been up here in so long. You've done so much with it. She wandered through the rooms, running her hands over furniture and peering into closets, all while making comments about market value and potential buyers. You know, if you ever wanted to sell, I could list this for you. Properties like this in coastal towns are super hot right now. We could probably get 1.5, maybe more if we stage it right. I continued painting, my brushstrokes steady, and told her I wasn't planning to sell. She laughed, a light tinkling sound that grated against my nerves. Oh, I know you're not thinking about it now, but eventually you might want to. I mean, it's a lot of house for one person and the maintenance costs alone. She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I asked about her work, her clients, her life in Portland, steering the conversation away from the estate. She stayed for another hour, taking photos of the ocean view and posting them to Instagram with a caption about family heritage and cherished memories. Then she left, promising to visit again soon, a promise I knew she'd only keep if she thought there was something to gain. My father's approach was more direct. He showed up one Sunday morning with a toolbox, claiming he'd noticed the porch railing looked unstable the last time he drove by. The fact that he'd never driven by, that he hadn't visited this house in over 3 years, made the lie transparent. But I let him inspect the railing, watching as he tugged on it experimentally and declared it needed reinforcing. I told him I'd already hired someone to handle repairs, and his jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that my refusal bothered him. He shifted tactics, asking about the property taxes, the insurance premiums, whether I'd updated the utilities into my name. Each question was designed to map the landscape, to understand what I'd done and what vulnerabilities might exist. I gave him the same carefully vague answers I'd given my mother, providing just enough information to seem cooperative without revealing anything substantive. He lingered for a while longer, making small talk about his job and commenting on how well I seemed to be handling everything. Then, as he was leaving, He delivered what I recognized as a warning disguised as advice. You know, Maya, your grandparents would have wanted this to benefit the whole family. They were always about keeping us together. Don't let this drive a wedge between us. I nodded, said nothing, and watched him drive away, already knowing that the wedge he feared was one they'd built themselves years ago. The weeks that followed felt like living in a holding pattern, waiting for the other shoe to drop while maintaining the facade that everything was normal. I returned to work in Sacramento, sitting through strategy meetings and client presentations with a focus that felt almost robotic. My boss commented that I seemed more centered lately, attributing it to having closure after my grandparents' passing. I smiled and agreed, not mentioning that what actually centered me was the knowledge that I'd built something unassailable, a fortress around the one thing they'd left me that truly mattered. At night, I found myself researching family estate disputes, reading case law and legal forums with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. I learned about undue influence claims, where family members argued that a beneficiary had manipulated the deceased into changing their will. I read about successful challenges based on mental incapacity, where courts had overturned bequests because the testator wasn't deemed competent at the time of signing. Each horror story I encountered reinforced my conviction that the irrevocable trust had been the right choice. My grandparents had been sharp until their final days. Their attorney had documented their mental clarity extensively, and the trust structure meant there was no will to contest because the assets had already been transferred before probate even began. Still, knowledge of potential attacks didn't eliminate the anxiety. I started having dreams where I'd arrive at the Redwood Crest house to find my family already inside, rearranging furniture and discussing renovation plans as if the place belonged to them. I'd wake up in the dark, my heart racing, and have to remind myself that the locks had been changed, that the title was held by an LLC they didn't even know existed, that every legal barrier I could construct was already in place. The dreams weren't rational, but fear rarely is. My mother called again 3 weeks after her first attempt, this time with a different angle. She mentioned that she'd been going through old photo albums and found pictures of family gatherings at my grandparents' house, images of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday celebrations from decades ago. Her voice took on a wistful quality as she described these memories, how much my grandparents had valued family unity, how they'd always tried to bring everyone together despite the distance and busy schedules. The subtext was obvious. She was building a narrative where my grandparents would have wanted their legacy shared equally, where keeping everything for myself violated some unspoken family covenant. I listened without interrupting, letting her spin the story she needed to tell. When she finally paused, waiting for my response, I simply said that I was honoring their wishes as stated in their will, and that I trusted their judgment about how their assets should be distributed. The silence on her end was heavy, loaded with unspoken frustration. Then she shifted again, her tone becoming more pointed. Your father and I are concerned that you're isolating yourself, Maya. This inheritance seems to be creating distance between you and the rest of us. We want to make sure you're thinking clearly and not making decisions you'll regret later. The implication that I wasn't thinking clearly, that grief or inexperience was clouding my judgment, sparked something hot and sharp in my chest. But I kept my voice level, refusing to give her the emotional reaction she was fishing for. Appreciate your concern, but I'm doing fine. I have good legal counsel, and I'm making thoughtful decisions about how to manage what Grandpa Rob and Grandma Maggie left me. The use of their names, personal and intimate, was deliberate. It reminded her that my relationship with them had been real and present, not reconstructed from old photographs and selective memory. She tried once more, suggesting that perhaps we could all sit down together and discuss things like adults, maybe with a mediator present to ensure everyone felt heard. I recognized this for what it was, an attempt to create a forum where they could apply collective pressure, where I'd be outnumbered and expected to compromise for the sake of family harmony. I declined politely, saying I didn't see the need for a formal discussion since everything was already settled. Her goodbye was clipped, barely masking her irritation, and I knew I just escalated things by refusing to play along. Sienna's next visit came without warning. I was at the Redwood Crest house on a Saturday, stripping old wallpaper from the upstairs bedroom, when I heard a car door slam. I looked out the window to see her emerging from her Mercedes, this time accompanied by a man I didn't recognize. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing slacks and a button-down shirt that screamed professional rather than casual. They approached the front door together, and Sienna's knock was confident, expectant. I came downstairs and opened the door, wallpaper scraper still in my hand. Sienna's smile was bright but didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, I brought someone I wanted you to meet. This is Gerald Hartman. He's a property appraiser I work with. I thought it might be helpful to get a professional assessment of the house, just so you have accurate information about what it's worth." Gerald extended his hand, and I shook it reflexively while my mind raced. An appraiser meant they were moving beyond casual suggestions into concrete planning. They wanted numbers, documentation, something they could use to pressure me or perhaps challenge my stewardship of the property. I released Gerald's hand and turned back to Sienna. "That's thoughtful, but I'm not looking to get an appraisal right now. I'm focused on making some personal repairs and updates, and I'm not in any rush to make decisions about the property's future." Sienna's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, but it wouldn't hurt to know what you're working with. Gerald is really good at what he does, and he could give you insights about which improvements would add the most value. It would only take an hour or so." I stood in the doorway, blocking entry, and made my position clear without being overtly hostile. "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I need to decline. If I decide I want an appraisal down the line, I'll reach out to someone myself." Gerald seemed to sense the tension and quickly excused himself, heading back to his car. Sienna lingered, her expression shifting from friendly to confused to something harder. "You're being really weird about this, Maya. We're just trying to help. Why are you acting like we're the enemy?" The question hung between us, and I could have let it pass, could have softened my stance and pretended everything was fine. But something in me had shifted over the past weeks, a willingness to name what was happening rather than dance around it. "You've never cared about this house or Grandpa and Grandma until now," I said quietly. "You didn't visit them. You didn't help them. And you certainly didn't show up for me when it mattered. So forgive me if I don't believe this sudden interest is about helping me." Her face flushed, and for a moment I thought she might actually engage honestly. Instead, she pivoted to offense. "That's not fair. We had busy lives. You chose to spend all your time up here, and that's fine, but don't act like you're some kind of martyr. And don't forget that Mom and Dad helped you plenty over the years. You're not as self-sufficient as you think." The gaslighting was textbook, rewriting history to position herself as reasonable and me as ungrateful. I didn't argue. I simply told her I needed to get back to work and closed the door, watching through the window as she stalked back to her car and peeled out of the driveway with more speed than necessary. That evening, I called Vincent and told him about the appraiser incident. He listened carefully, then asked if there had been any other unusual contacts or attempts to access the property. I mentioned my parents' increased communication and Sienna's multiple visits. He was quiet for a moment before speaking, his tone carrying a note of concern. "They're gathering information, testing boundaries. It's possible they're preparing to make a formal challenge, maybe claiming undue influence or arguing that your grandparents intended for the estate to be shared. We should be ready for that possibility." He advised me to document everything, every phone call, every visit, every attempt to gain access to information about the property or finances. If this did escalate to legal action, having a contemporaneous record would be invaluable. He also suggested I consider changing the locks again and installing a security system with cameras, both to protect the physical property and to have video evidence if anyone tried to enter without permission. The idea of needing cameras to keep my own family out felt surreal, but I recognized the wisdom in his advice. The next day I drove back to Redwood Crest and met with a security company. They installed cameras at the front door, back door, and along the driveway, all feeding to an app on my phone that would alert me to any motion. I also had the locks changed again, this time to a smart lock system that I could control remotely. It felt excessive, paranoid even, but the first time I checked the camera feed and saw my father's car pulling into the driveway on a weekday afternoon when he thought I wouldn't be there, I was grateful for the precaution. I watched on my phone from my office in Sacramento as he walked around the exterior of the house, trying the door handles and peering through windows. He spent nearly 20 minutes circling the property before giving up and leaving. I saved the footage, time-stamped and clear, and sent it to Vincent with a brief message. "He's escalating." Vincent's response was immediate. "Good that you have this. Don't confront him directly. Let him think you don't know." The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was exhausting. I found myself checking the camera feeds compulsively, even in the middle of meetings, half expecting to see someone attempting a break-in. My sleep quality deteriorated, and I started relying on melatonin just to get a few hours of rest. Friends at work noticed I seemed on edge, and I brushed off their concern with vague mentions of stress from managing my grandparents' estate. No one pushed for details, and I was grateful for their discretion. My Aunt Lucia reached out again during this period, inviting me to lunch on a Sunday afternoon. We met at a small bistro in Berkeley, halfway between our respective cities, and I tried to relax into the normalcy of the setting. She asked about the house, about whether I decided to keep it or sell, and I told her I was leaning toward keeping it as a weekend retreat. She smiled, saying that seemed fitting, that my grandparents would have loved knowing I was taking care of the place. Then she surprised me by saying she'd spoken to my mother recently, that my mother had mentioned some tension regarding the inheritance. Lucia's expression was careful, not accusatory but clearly concerned. I know this isn't easy, Maya. Family and money rarely mix well. But I hope you know that whatever you decide, I support you. You're under no obligation to share what was left to you. Your grandparents made their choice for reasons that mattered to them. Her validation meant more than I could express. I found myself telling her things I hadn't shared with anyone else, the misgraduation, the pattern of neglect, the way I'd always felt like an afterthought in my own family. She listened with a sadness in her eyes that told me she'd witnessed some of this dynamic herself over the years. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You deserved better, she said simply. And you deserve to protect what they gave you without guilt. We talked for another hour about lighter things, her work as a teacher, her plans to travel during summer break, her garden that was perpetually at war with deer. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in weeks, and when we parted ways, I carried that lightness with me for the rest of the day. But the reprieve was temporary. That evening, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read "Important Family Matter," and when I opened it, I found a formal-looking letter addressed to me. The letter was from a law firm in Portland, Whitmore and Associates, and it stated that they had been retained by Patricia and David Torres to represent their interests regarding the estate of Robert and Margaret Calloway. The language was dense with legalese, but the core message was clear. My parents were claiming that the will had been improperly influenced, that I had taken advantage of my grandparents' declining health to secure an inheritance that should rightfully be divided among all grandchildren. They were demanding that I provide full documentation of all estate assets, agree to mediation with a neutral third party, and consider a voluntary redistribution that would honor what they termed the spirit of familial equity. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat. Should I refuse to cooperate, they would pursue all available legal remedies, including filing a formal challenge in probate court. I read the letter twice, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and vindication. I'd known this was coming, had prepared for exactly this scenario, but seeing it in writing still felt like a punch to the gut. They weren't just asking anymore. They were threatening, willing to drag me through court, and publicly accuse me of elder abuse if I didn't surrender what my grandparents had chosen to give me. I forwarded the email to Vincent immediately, then to Rachel Kimura, the litigation attorney he'd recommended I keep on retainer for exactly this possibility. Rachel called me within an hour, her voice brisk and professional. This is a weak claim, she said after reviewing the letter. Undue influence is notoriously difficult to prove, and they'd need evidence that you somehow coerced or manipulated your grandparents. Given that the will was drafted 2 years before they passed, when they were both demonstrably competent, and given that you were their primary caregiver during that period, they have no real standing. This is a pressure tactic, nothing more. She explained that we had 2 options. We could ignore the letter entirely, force them to actually file a lawsuit if they were serious, or we could respond with a cease and desist that made our position clear and warned them about the consequences of continuing. I asked her which she recommended, and she didn't hesitate. Respond. Make it clear you're not intimidated, and that you have counsel prepared to defend aggressively. Sometimes that's enough to make people reconsider whether they really want to go down this road. Rachel drafted a response that was both measured and uncompromising. It detailed the timeline of my grandparents' will, the documentation of their mental competency, and the fact that the estate had already been transferred into an irrevocable trust, making any challenge moot since there were no longer personal assets to contest. The letter also included a warning that any public accusations of wrongdoing would be considered defamatory and met with appropriate legal action. She sent it directly to Whitmore and Associates, copying my parents at their home address, ensuring there would be no ambiguity about our stance. For 3 days there was silence. I went through the motions of my daily routine, but my attention was split, constantly checking my email and phone for any response. I prepared myself for the possibility that they'd actually file suit, that this would become a prolonged legal battle requiring depositions and court appearances and significant expense. Vincent assured me that the trust structure made victory virtually certain, but even certain victories required time and energy I resented having to spend. On the 4th day, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was male, older, measured. "Ms. Torres, my name is Douglas Whitmore. I represent your parents. I'm calling to see if there's any possibility of resolving this matter without further conflict." His tone was diplomatic, the voice of someone accustomed to negotiating settlements. I told him I'd received his letter, and that my attorneys had responded. He acknowledged this, then pivoted to what he termed a reasonable compromise. "What if we could agree on a token distribution to your sister, something that recognizes family connection without substantially impacting your inheritance? Perhaps $100,000, which would allow everyone to feel the estate was handled fairly." I felt my jaw tighten. "My grandparents made their decision deliberately," I said. "They left everything to me because I was the one who cared for them. Giving money to someone who couldn't be bothered to visit them would dishonor their wishes." Douglas tried a different angle, suggesting that litigation would be expensive for everyone involved, that even if I ultimately prevailed, the costs and stress might not be worth the principle. It was a classic lawyer tactic, using the threat of inconvenience to pressure settlement. But I'd already decided that this wasn't negotiable. "If your clients want to file suit, they can do so," I told him. "But they should understand that all evidence will become part of public record, including documentation of who actually visited and cared for Robert and Margaret Calloway during their final years. I don't think that story will reflect well on them." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him recalculating. He thanked me for my time and ended the call. I immediately texted Rachel to inform her of the conversation, and she replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Good. You held the line." That night, I allowed myself a small glass of bourbon, sitting on my apartment balcony and watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The fight wasn't over, but I'd survived the first real assault, and I hadn't given an inch. The following 2 weeks unfolded with an eerie quiet that felt more ominous than reassuring. I kept expecting another letter, another phone call, some escalation that would force the confrontation into the open. Instead, there was nothing. My parents stopped texting. Sienna's Instagram posts continued with their usual frequency, but none mentioned Redwood Crest or family matters. The silence felt tactical, like they were regrouping, consulting with their attorney about next moves, or perhaps hoping I'd interpret their withdrawal as acceptance and let my guard down. I didn't let my guard down. If anything, I became more vigilant, checking the security cameras multiple times each day, and keeping detailed logs of every attempted contact, no matter how innocuous it seemed. Rachel had advised me that if this did go to court, establishing a pattern of harassment or attempted manipulation would strengthen our position significantly. So when my mother sent a text asking if I'd be attending a cousin's wedding in September, I screenshot it and saved it in a dedicated folder. When my father left a voicemail saying he'd driven past the Redwood Crest house and noticed the gutters looked clean, wondering if I'd hired someone, I saved that too. Every breadcrumb was documentation, every interaction potential evidence. Work became my refuge during this period, the one place where the inheritance drama couldn't follow me. The green energy startup where I'd been employed was in the middle of a major expansion, preparing to launch a new solar panel technology that promised significantly higher efficiency at lower cost. I'd been promoted to project manager 3 months before my grandparents passed, and now I threw myself into the role with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. I stayed late reviewing supply chain logistics, arrived early to prep for investor meetings, and volunteered for every presentation and client pitch that came available. My boss praised my dedication, and my colleagues joked about my transformation into a workaholic. None of them knew I was simply avoiding the empty hours at home where my thoughts would spiral into worst-case scenarios. During one particularly long evening at the office, as I was finalizing a presentation deck for a funding round meeting, I received an email from my Aunt Lucia. The subject line was just my name, Maya, and when I opened it, I found a brief message followed by an attachment. I thought you should see this. She didn't explain further, and the attachment was an audio file, 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. I plugged in my headphones and pressed play, uncertain what I was about to hear. My mother's voice filled my ears, slightly muffled as if recorded from across a room. She was speaking to someone, her tone carrying that particular quality of controlled emotion she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cutting. I don't like speaking badly about my own daughter, but Maya has always been manipulative. Even as a child, she knew how to play on people's sympathies. My grandparents were elderly and vulnerable, and she took advantage of that vulnerability to secure an inheritance that was never meant to be hers alone. My father must have been in the room too because I heard him murmur agreement in the background. The recording continued with my mother elaborating on this theme, painting a picture of me as a calculating opportunist who deliberately isolated my grandparents from the rest of the family in order to influence their estate planning. She claimed I'd discouraged them from visiting, that I'd intercepted phone calls and letters, that I'd essentially held them hostage emotionally during their final years. None of it was true, but she delivered each lie with such conviction that I understood immediately how dangerous this narrative could be if circulated widely enough. The recording ended with her saying that they were consulting with attorneys about options, because someone needed to stand up for what was right. I sat in the empty office, the city lights creating geometric patterns on my desk through the window, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. They were attempting to destroy my reputation, to reframe my relationship with my grandparents as predatory rather than loving. If this story gained traction among extended family, among people who didn't know the truth, it could do real damage. I'd become the villain in a narrative they were carefully constructing, and villains don't deserve sympathy or support when they're challenged. I called Rachel immediately, not caring that it was past 9 in the evening. She answered on the third ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. I explained about the recording, sent it to her email while we were still on the phone, and waited as she listened. When she finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "This is actually helpful for us," she said finally. "If they're spreading defamatory statements, it gives us grounds to pursue legal action beyond just defending the estate." "Where did your aunt get this recording?" I texted Lucia asking for context, and her response came quickly. She'd been at a family gathering, a barbecue at a cousin's house, when my mother had launched into this monologue. Lucia had quietly used her phone to record it, sensing that I might need evidence of what was being said behind my back. She debated whether to send it, not wanting to hurt me, but ultimately decided I deserved to know the truth about how I was being portrayed. I forwarded her explanation to Rachel, who made an approving sound. "Your aunt did you a favor. This recording proves they're engaged in a coordinated campaign to damage your credibility. We can use this." Rachel's plan was methodical and strategic. We would compile a comprehensive response document that laid out the factual timeline of my relationship with my grandparents, complete with dated photographs, visitor logs from the assisted living facility where they'd spent their final months, and testimony from neighbors and healthcare workers who could verify that I'd been their primary support system. We'd include the recordings and transcripts of my mother's defamatory statements, along with evidence that contradicted each specific claim. Then we'd send this document to every family member who'd been exposed to my mother's narrative, not as an attack but as a correction of the record. Over the next week, I worked with Rachel and Vincent to assemble everything we needed. Vincent reached out to the administrator at Pinehaven Gardens, the facility where my grandparents had lived during their last 6 months. The administrator remembered me well and was willing to provide a statement confirming that I'd visited an average of 3 times per week, often staying for hours, while other family members had visited rarely if at all. She also confirmed that my grandparents had been mentally sharp until very near the end, capable of making their own decisions and expressing their wishes clearly. I dug through old photos, finding images of me helping my grandfather in his workshop, teaching my grandmother how to use her iPad, sitting with both of them during doctor's appointments. Each photo was dated and geotagged, creating an irrefutable timeline. I also requested phone records from my grandparents' service provider, showing the frequency of calls between us compared to calls with other family members. The data was stark. Over a 2-year period, I'd called them 237 times. My parents had called 18 times. Sienna had called 4 times. Rachel organized everything into a professional-looking document, 12 pages with section headers and footnotes, the kind of formatting that conveyed authority and thoroughness. The introduction was direct and unflinching. This document addresses false and defamatory statements that have been circulated regarding Maya Torres and her relationship with her late grandparents, Robert and Margaret Calloway. The following evidence conclusively demonstrates that Ms. Torres provided consistent, loving care to her grandparents during their final years, and that their decision to leave their estate to her was both intentional and well considered. The document went on to detail each specific lie my mother had told, followed immediately by evidence refuting it. The claim that I'd isolated my grandparents was countered with visitor logs showing my parents' and sisters' minimal presence. The suggestion that I'd manipulated vulnerable elders was addressed with medical records, documenting their mental competency and statements from their physician. The insinuation that the inheritance was improper was met with copies of the will, notarized and witnessed, showing it had been executed 2 years before their deaths with full legal oversight. Rachel sent the document to 17 family members, everyone who'd been at the barbecue where my mother's speech had been recorded, plus several others who'd been mentioned in subsequent conversations as people my mother was trying to influence. She also sent copies to Douglas Whitmore, my parents' attorney, and directly to my parents at their home address. The subject line was simple: Statement of facts regarding the Calloway estate. The response was immediate and multifaceted. Within hours, I started receiving texts from cousins and aunts and uncles, some apologizing for believing the false narrative, others expressing shock at how thoroughly they'd been misled. My cousin Derek, who'd always been someone I considered a friend despite the family chaos, called me directly. "I'm sorry, Maya. I should have asked you directly instead of just accepting what your mom was saying. What you did for Grandpa Rob and Grandma Maggie was incredible, and they were lucky to have you." Not everyone was convinced. A few family members responded defensively, suggesting that maybe there was truth on both sides, that family disputes were always more complicated than they seemed. But the overwhelming majority shifted their stance once confronted with documented evidence. The court of family opinion, which my mother had been trying to manipulate in her favor, swung decisively toward me. More importantly, the existence of this document and its wide circulation meant that any future legal challenge would be significantly weakened. A jury would see that the narrative of manipulation had been publicly debunked, supported by testimony from neutral third parties. My parents' attorney, Douglas Whitmore, sent a terse email acknowledging receipt of the document, but offering no substantive response. Rachel interpreted this as a sign that he was advising his clients to back down, that the case he'd initially thought might have merit was actually far weaker than they'd represented. She was right. 3 days after we sent the comprehensive response, I received a formal letter from Whitmore and Associates stating that Patricia and David Torres had decided not to pursue legal action regarding the Calloway estate. The letter contained no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a clinical statement that they were withdrawing their challenge and would make no further claims. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in my apartment with the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched tight for months. It was over. The threat that had loomed since the day Vincent first called me about the inheritance had dissipated, not with a dramatic courtroom showdown but with the quiet recognition that they couldn't win. They'd tested every boundary, probed every weakness, and found nothing they could exploit. The irrevocable trust had done exactly what it was designed to do, and the documentation of their defamatory campaign had eliminated any sympathy they might have garnered. I forwarded the letter to Vincent and Rachel, then to my Aunt Lucia with a brief message of thanks for her support and willingness to provide the recording that had proved so crucial. Lucia responded with a phone call, her voice warm with relief. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You stood up for yourself and for what your grandparents wanted. That takes courage." We talked for a while about other things, making plans to meet for lunch again soon, and when we hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months. That weekend, I drove to Redwood Crest with a sense of purpose rather than defensive anxiety. The house looked beautiful in the early autumn light, the rose garden still blooming despite the cooling temperatures, the ocean beyond reflecting silver and blue. I'd finished most of the repairs I'd planned, the walls freshly painted, the floors refinished, the kitchen updated with new appliances that my grandmother would have loved. The place felt alive again. Not a museum to the past, but a space that honored memory while embracing the present. I spent the day working in the garden, pruning back the roses and planting bulbs that would bloom in spring. The physical labor was meditative, my hands in the soil, the salt air filling my lungs, the cry of gulls providing a soundtrack to my thoughts. I thought about my grandparents, about the hundreds of small moments we'd shared in this place, teaching me to identify constellations from the back porch, showing me how to properly stake tomato plants so they grow straight and strong, sitting together in comfortable silence while they read and I worked on school assignments at the kitchen table. They'd given me more than property or money. They'd given me proof that I was worth someone's time and attention, that my presence mattered, that love didn't have to be earned through performance or competition. In a family where I'd always felt like an afterthought, they'd made me feel central. And in return, I'd shown up for them when they needed someone. Not because I expected an inheritance, but because that's what you do for people you love. The fact that they'd chosen to leave everything to me wasn't a reward for service rendered. It was their final statement about what they valued, about who had valued them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I sat on the porch swing and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found my mother's number and stared at it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to call, to ask why they'd fought so hard for something they'd never cared about, to demand an explanation for the lies and manipulation. But I realized that any answer she gave would just be another version of the same deflection and justification I'd heard my entire life. They'd never see themselves as the problem. In their narrative, they were the reasonable ones, the family-minded ones, and I was the selfish daughter who'd refused to share. I didn't call. Instead, I blocked the number, then blocked my father's and Sienna's as well. I removed them from my social media, unsubscribed from family group chats, and systematically severed every digital connection that had allowed them access to my life. It felt radical and final, a burning of bridges that couldn't be rebuilt. But it also felt necessary. They'd shown me repeatedly that their presence in my life was conditional, dependent on my willingness to accept less than I deserved and give more than was fair. I was done accepting those terms. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee on the old percolator my grandfather had used every day for 40 years. I carried the mug out to the porch and watched the sunrise over the ocean, the water turning from gray to gold as light spread across the horizon. The house was quiet except for the distant crash of waves and the occasional call of a seabird. It was the kind of peace my grandparents had cultivated here, and I understood now that maintaining it required protecting it from people who would disturb it for their own purposes. I spent the rest of the weekend organizing the interior, moving some of my own belongings up from Sacramento so the house would feel more lived in when I visited. I hung artwork I'd collected over the years, arranged books on the shelves that lined the living room, and set up the second bedroom as a home office where I could work remotely when needed. The house was becoming mine not just legally but emotionally, a place where I could exist without performance or pretense. On Monday, back in Sacramento, I walked into a meeting with my startup's executive team and presented the solar panel project with a confidence that surprised even me. The months of defending myself, of marshaling evidence and standing firm against pressure, had taught me something valuable about my own strength. I'd faced down people who were supposed to love me and had chosen myself instead. If I could do that, I could handle anything a boardroom might throw at me. The project was approved for full funding, and my role was expanded to include oversight of implementation across 3 states. It was a significant promotion, one that would have felt overwhelming a year ago. Now it felt like a natural next step. I'd proven I could manage complexity and conflict. Business challenges seemed almost simple by comparison. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. I split my time between Sacramento during the week and Redwood Crest on weekends, the house becoming a sanctuary where I could recharge and reconnect with myself. I hired a local landscaping service to maintain the garden during my absences, and I established relationships with neighbors who'd known my grandparents and were happy to keep an eye on the property. The house became part of the community again, rather than a lonely monument, and that felt like honoring my grandparents' legacy in a way that went beyond mere preservation. I also started spending time with Aunt Lucia more regularly, having dinner with her once or twice a month, and discovering that we had more in common than I'd realized. She shared stories about my mother's childhood, details that helped me understand without excusing the woman my mother had become. Lucia had made different choices, prioritizing authenticity over appearance, and our growing friendship felt like a reclamation of family on my own terms. The holidays approached, and with them came the traditional assumption that I'd participate in family gatherings. An invitation arrived via email from a cousin organizing Thanksgiving dinner, a cheerful message asking for my RSVP, and whether I had any dietary restrictions. I stared at the invitation for a long time, imagining what it would be like to sit around a table with my parents in Siena, to pretend that nothing had happened, to smile through passive-aggressive comments and veiled criticisms for the sake of tradition. I declined politely, saying I had other plans. Those plans turned out to be Thanksgiving at Redwood Crest with Aunt Lucia and a couple of her teacher friends, a small gathering where we cooked together and laughed easily, and no one questioned my worth or my choices. It was the best holiday meal I'd had in years, maybe ever, and as we sat around the table my grandparents had used for decades, I felt their presence in a way that had nothing to do with ghosts or supernatural comfort. They were present in the example they'd set, in the values they'd modeled, in the home they'd built and shared. December arrived with storms that battered the coast, and I found myself at the Redwood Crest house more often, drawn by the dramatic weather and the way the waves crashed against the rocks below the property. I worked remotely several days, taking calls from the home office I'd set up, and found my productivity actually improved when I wasn't in the city. My boss was supportive when I proposed shifting to a hybrid schedule, spending 3 days in the Sacramento office and 2 working from Redwood Crest. The arrangement gave me the best of both worlds, professional engagement and personal sanctuary. On a particularly stormy afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the eaves, I received an unexpected email. The sender was Siena, and the subject line read simply, "I'm sorry." I hesitated before opening it, unsure whether this was genuine contrition or another manipulation. The message itself was brief, only 3 paragraphs, but the tone was different from anything she'd written before. She acknowledged that she'd been wrong to challenge the inheritance, that she'd let our parents influence her thinking, and that she regretted the damage done to our relationship. She didn't ask for anything, didn't suggest we should reconcile or try to repair what had been broken. She simply apologized and said she hoped someday I might be able to forgive her. I read the email several times, trying to assess its sincerity. Part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to think that maybe she genuinely reflected and recognized her mistakes. But another part, the part that had learned hard lessons about self-protection, remained skeptical. Words were easy. Changed behavior was what mattered. I saved the email without responding, deciding that time would reveal whether this was a genuine turning point or just another strategy. Either way, the burden of proof was on her, not me. As the year drew to a close, I found myself taking stock of everything that had changed. 12 months earlier, I'd been standing on a graduation stage, alone in a crowd, wondering why I'd never been enough for my family. Now I sat in a house I owned outright, holding assets that would provide security for decades, surrounded by evidence that I had been enough for the people who truly mattered. The validation I'd been seeking hadn't come from forcing my parents to see me. It had come from accepting that their inability to value me was their failure, not mine. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the porch at Redwood Crest and watched fireworks bloom over the distant town, their reflections shimmering on the dark water. The air was cold but still, the storm having passed, and the stars above were brilliant in their clarity. I thought about my grandfather's words, the ones I'd remembered during the darkest days of conflict. Protect what's worth keeping. I'd protected the inheritance, yes, but more than that, I'd protected my sense of self, my right to establish boundaries, my refusal to accept crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table. The new year arrived with its traditional promise of fresh starts and new possibilities. For me, it felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something I'd already started. The ongoing work of building a life defined by my own values rather than my family's expectations. I had the resources now to pursue projects that mattered to me, to take calculated risks to create something meaningful. The inheritance wasn't just money and property. It was freedom, the freedom to choose my own path without financial desperation forcing compromises. In the months that followed, I used some of the investment income to fund a scholarship at UC Davis for students in sustainable business, specifically targeting first-generation college students who lacked family financial support. The scholarship was named for my grandparents, and the inaugural award went to a young woman whose story reminded me of my own, someone who'd worked multiple jobs while earning her degree and had no family attending her graduation. I met her briefly at the award ceremony, saw the tears in her eyes when she realized what this meant for her future, and understood that this was how legacies truly lived on. Not through hoarded wealth but through impact that rippled outward. The Redwood Crest House became more than a weekend retreat. I started hosting small gatherings for environmental nonprofit groups, letting them use the space for planning sessions and retreats, carrying forward my grandparents' spirit of generosity in a way that aligned with my own passions. The house filled with voices and ideas, and I knew they would have loved seeing their home used this way, as a hub for community and purpose, rather than a museum or a trophy. My career continued to flourish, the solar panel project exceeding all projections and leading to new opportunities within the company. I was offered a vice president position, one that would come with significant equity and decision-making authority. I accepted, and my first act in the new role was to establish a program partnering with community colleges to create pathways into green energy careers for students from underserved backgrounds. It felt like a way of paying forward the leg up my grandparents had given me, creating opportunities for others who'd been told they needed to be entirely self-sufficient. Life wasn't perfect. I still had moments of sadness about my fractured family relationships, still occasionally wondered if I could have handled things differently. But those moments became rarer as time passed, replaced by a growing certainty that I'd made the right choices. The people who mattered, Aunt Lucia and a handful of cousins who'd reached out after the truth came out, remained in my life. The others, the ones who'd believed lies without asking for my side, I let go without regret. On the anniversary of my grandparents' deaths, I drove to Redwood Crest and spent the day tending their grave at the small cemetery overlooking the ocean. I brought flowers from the garden they'd planted, roses that had bloomed again thanks to the care I'd given them. I sat on the bench near their headstone and told them about the year that had passed, about the scholarship in the house and the work I was doing. I told them about the fight I'd had to wage to keep what they'd given me, about the strength I'd found in defending their wishes. And I thanked them, not just for the inheritance but for seeing me when I'd felt invisible, for teaching me that worth isn't measured by how others treat you but by how you treat yourself and the people who matter. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, I made a promise to them and to myself. I would continue protecting what was worth keeping, not just the physical assets but the principles they'd embodied. Integrity, generosity, the courage to make difficult choices and stand by them. These were the real inheritance, more valuable than any house or investment account, and they were mine to carry forward into whatever came next. The spring morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the Redwood Crest roses bloom earlier than usual. I'd been living in a comfortable rhythm for nearly 6 months since my parents withdrew their legal challenge, splitting my time between the coastal house and my Sacramento responsibilities, finding a balance that felt sustainable rather than exhausting. The wounds from the inheritance battle had begun to scar over, still tender when pressed but no longer bleeding. I'd convinced myself that the worst was behind me, that my family had finally accepted defeat and moved on with their lives. I should have known better than to mistake temporary silence for permanent peace. The first indication that something was shifting came through an unexpected channel. I received a LinkedIn message from someone I didn't know. A woman named Jennifer Krause who identified herself as a freelance journalist working on a piece about family inheritance disputes. She said she'd heard about my situation through mutual connections and wondered if I'd be willing to share my story for an article she was writing about how wealth transfer can create rifts in otherwise loving families. The phrasing alone set off alarm bells. Otherwise loving families implied a narrative framework where the conflict was mutual, where both sides bore equal responsibility for the breakdown. I knew immediately that my mother was behind this somehow. I didn't respond to Jennifer's message, but I did forward it to Rachel with a note asking whether this was something I needed to worry about. Rachel called me within the hour, her tone carrying an edge of concern I'd rarely heard from her. "This is a new tactic," she said. "If they can't win in court, they'll try to win in the court of public opinion." They're probably feeding this journalist a version of events that makes you look like the aggressor and them like victims of your greed. The article, if published, could do reputational damage, even if nothing in it is technically actionable. We discussed options, and Rachel advised that I should consider reaching out to Jennifer directly, not to participate in her article, but to make clear that any publication containing false or misleading information about me would result in immediate legal action. She helped me draft a response that was polite but firm, stating that I would not be participating in any interview, that my family situation was private, and that I had legal counsel prepared to address any defamatory content that might appear in print. I sent the message and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I received a call from my Aunt Lucia, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Have you seen what Patricia is doing? She's been reaching out to everyone in the extended family, giving interviews about how you've torn the family apart. She's positioning herself as the heartbroken mother whose daughter chose money over family bonds." I felt my stomach drop. Lucia continued, explaining that my mother had been particularly active on social media, posting vague but pointed messages about the pain of estrangement and the importance of forgiveness, all carefully worded to avoid naming me directly but clearly referencing our situation. I pulled up my mother's Facebook page, using a dummy account I'd created months ago precisely for situations like this where I needed to monitor her activities without her knowing. Her recent posts were a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. One showed a photo of her in Siena at a coffee shop, captioned, "When you only have one daughter who still values family." Another was a shared article about inheritance disputes, with her comments, "Sometimes people show you who they really are when money enters the picture." Each post had dozens of sympathetic comments from friends and distant relatives who didn't know the full story, offering support and expressing shock that anyone could be so heartless. Rachel's assessment proved accurate. My mother couldn't attack me legally, so she'd launched a campaign to attack me socially. She was playing the long game, slowly building a narrative across multiple platforms and conversations, counting on the fact that most people would accept her version of events without seeking contrary evidence. It was insidious precisely because it wasn't a single big lie but rather 1,000 small insinuations, each individually deniable but collectively damaging. She was painting herself as the wronged party, the loving mother rejected by an ungrateful child, and the audience she'd cultivated over years of social media presence was primed to believe her. I spent the next several days wrestling with how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to trust that people who truly knew me would see through the manipulation. But another part recognized that silence could be interpreted as guilt, that allowing her narrative to go unchallenged would give it time to solidify into accepted truth. I consulted with Rachel, who suggested we could send cease and desist letters demanding she stop making public statements about our family situation, but acknowledged that enforcement would be difficult given the vague nature of most of her posts. Then something unexpected happened that changed my approach entirely. I received an email from Jennifer Krause, the journalist who'd initially reached out about the inheritance article. Her message was apologetic and surprisingly candid. She explained that after I declined to participate, she'd continued her research and had spoken with several people who knew my family, including some who'd provided a very different perspective than what my mother had offered. Jennifer had also obtained copies of the court documents related to the withdrawn legal challenge, which included affidavits and evidence that contradicted my mother's claims of manipulation and isolation. Jennifer's email continued with a proposal that caught me off guard. She said she was no longer interested in writing a generic piece about inheritance disputes. Instead, she wanted to write an investigative article about how families weaponize public sympathy to pressure relatives into surrendering legal inheritances, using my situation as the central case study. She would present the full documentation, the visitor logs, the phone records, the timeline of care I provided versus my family's minimal involvement. She would expose the legal challenge and its baselessness, the defamatory statements my mother had made, and the social media campaign currently underway. But she needed my cooperation to do it properly, needed me to go on record with my version of events and provide access to the evidence I'd compiled. I sat with her email for a long time, weighing the risks and benefits. Going public meant inviting scrutiny, opening myself up to criticism from people who might view the situation differently than I did. It meant making permanent what had been private, creating a public record that would exist on the internet forever. But it also meant controlling the narrative, presenting the truth in full context, rather than allowing it to be distorted through my mother's selective editing. And maybe, just maybe, it would help other people in similar situations, people being pressured by family members to give up inheritances they'd legally and rightfully received. I called Rachel and read her Jennifer's email. There was a long pause before she responded. "This is a calculated risk," she said slowly. "If the article is well researched and factually accurate, it could shut down your mother's smear campaign permanently. No one can claim you're hiding the truth if you've put everything on record. But you need to be prepared for blowback. Your mother will likely escalate before she backs down, and other family members may feel caught in the middle. Are you ready for that?" I thought about my grandparents, about the quiet dignity with which they'd lived their lives, never seeking attention or validation from people who didn't matter. But I also thought about the scholarship student I'd met, the one whose eyes had filled with tears when she realized someone had chosen to invest in her future. If my story could help even one person stand firm against family pressure to surrender what was rightfully theirs, wasn't that worth the discomfort of public exposure? I told Rachel I wanted to move forward, but only if we could review the article before publication to ensure accuracy. Jennifer agreed to my terms, and we began a series of conversations that stretched over 3 weeks. She was thorough in a way I hadn't expected from someone working on a freelance piece, requesting documentation for every claim and cross-referencing my timeline with third-party sources. She interviewed the administrator at Pinehaven Gardens where my grandparents had lived, spoke with neighbors in Redwood Crest who'd witnessed my regular presence versus my family's absence, and even tracked down the healthcare workers who'd provided in-home care during my grandparents' final weeks. She reviewed the trust documents with an attorney she'd consulted to ensure she understood the legal mechanics, and she obtained copies of the defamatory recording my Aunt Lucia had provided. The article began to take shape as something more comprehensive than I'd anticipated. Jennifer framed it not just as a personal story but as an examination of elder care, family dynamics, and the increasingly common phenomenon of adult children who provide the bulk of caregiving, but then face challenges from siblings who'd been largely absent. She interviewed experts in estate planning and family law, contextualizing my situation within broader trends. The piece became less about me specifically and more about the systemic issues that allow families to exploit caregivers who've sacrificed time and resources to help aging relatives. When Jennifer sent me the draft for review, I read it 3 times, my emotions cycling between vindication, sadness, and a strange sense of exposure. She'd included details I'd forgotten, moments like the time I'd slept in a chair at the hospital when my grandfather had pneumonia, or the weekend I'd spent researching and comparing memory care facilities when my grandmother's dementia began to progress. She'd also included the stark statistics, the phone records showing my parents had called my grandparents 18 times in 2 years, while I'd called 237 times. The numbers told a story that needed no embellishment. The article also didn't shy away from my family's perspective, or at least their stated perspective. Jennifer had reached out to my parents in Siena for comment, and while they'd initially agreed to speak with her, they'd withdrawn once they realized the direction of the piece. Their attorney, Douglas Whitmore, had provided a brief statement saying his clients declined to participate in what they viewed as a one-sided attack on their character. Jennifer included this refusal in the article, noting that despite multiple requests and offers to present their evidence, they'd chosen not to engage, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions about why. I approved the article with minor factual corrections, and Jennifer submitted it to a mid-sized online publication that specialized in long-form journalism about social issues. The piece was scheduled to run in early June, timed to coincide with what Jennifer called the conversation around estate planning season, when many outlets published content about wills and inheritances. She warned me that once it went live, I should expect significant attention, both supportive and critical, and that I should prepare myself for the possibility that my family would respond publicly. The article published on a Wednesday morning, and by noon my phone was flooded with notifications. The piece had been titled The Inheritance Trap: When Caregiving Meets Family Greed, and it opened with a vivid description of my graduation day, the empty seats, and the beach photo that had shattered any remaining illusions about my family's priorities. Jennifer's writing was compelling without being melodramatic, letting the facts speak for themselves while providing enough emotional context for readers to understand the human cost of the situation. The response was overwhelming. Within 24 hours, The article had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories of family inheritance battles, many expressing relief that someone had finally articulated the experience of being pressured to surrender rightful bequests. Several attorneys who specialized in estate planning reached out to say they were recommending the article to clients dealing with similar situations. A handful of critics accused me of airing private family business for attention, but they were vastly outnumbered by people offering support and validation. My mother's response was predictably explosive. She posted a lengthy Facebook status claiming she'd been blindsided by the article, that she'd never been given a fair chance to present her side of the story, and that the portrayal of her as neglectful was a cruel distortion of reality. She included several old photos of family gatherings at my grandparents' house, attempting to provide visual evidence of her involvement. But attentive readers noticed what I'd noticed immediately. Every photo was from the same two occasions, Thanksgiving dinners years apart, suggesting exactly the minimal engagement the article had described. Sienna took a different approach. She posted an Instagram story sequence that started with a screenshot of the article's headline, followed by several slides of text where she positioned herself as caught in the middle of a conflict she'd never wanted. She claimed she'd tried to stay neutral, that she'd never intended to challenge the inheritance until our parents convinced her it was the right thing to do, and that she regretted how everything had unfolded. Her tone was calculated to generate sympathy without directly contradicting the article's facts, a careful dance between admission and deflection. The social media response from extended family was mixed but leaned heavily in my favor. Several cousins shared the article with comments supporting my position and apologizing for initially believing my mother's version of events. My Aunt Lucia posted a passionate defense, saying she'd witnessed my devotion to my grandparents firsthand, and that the article only scratched the surface of the care I'd provided. A few relatives stayed silent, presumably unwilling to take sides publicly, and I respected that neutrality more than performative support from people who doubted me. The most unexpected response came from the scholarship student I'd funded, the young woman who'd reminded me of myself. She somehow connected the article to me, possibly through the mention of UC Davis and sustainable business, and sent me an email that made me cry at my desk. She wrote that reading about my experience had helped her understand her own family dynamics, particularly the way her relatives had criticized her for accepting financial help from a mentor, instead of relying on family who'd never offered any assistance. She thanked me not just for the scholarship, but for showing her that choosing yourself over toxic family expectations wasn't selfish, it was survival. In the weeks following the article's publication, I noticed a shift in how I moved through the world. People at work who'd known vaguely about my family situation now approached me with a different kind of respect, recognizing that my composure during the inheritance battle had required significant strength. I received invitations to speak on panels about family dynamics and estate planning, opportunities one mostly declined because I wasn't interested in becoming the poster child for inheritance disputes. But I did agree to one appearance at a legal conference where Rachel was presenting, sharing my perspective in a way that might help attorneys better support clients facing similar pressures. The article also brought unexpected financial opportunities. A literary agent reached out asking if I'd considered expanding my story into a book, and while I wasn't interested in writing a memoir, the conversation made me think about other ways to use my platform. I ended up working with a nonprofit that provided legal aid to elderly people being financially exploited by family members, using some of the inheritance income to fund their services, and occasionally sharing my story in their fundraising materials. It felt like a way of channeling the pain of my experience into something protective for others. My parents and Sienna went quiet after the initial social media flurry, presumably on advice from their attorney that further public statements would only make things worse. Douglas Whitmore sent a letter to Jennifer's publication demanding a retraction, but the outlet's legal team reviewed his claims and found no grounds for correction, let alone retraction. Every fact in the article was documented, every quote attributed, every conclusion supported by evidence. The letter was dismissed, and I never heard from Whitmore again. Summer arrived, and with it came a sense of true closure I hadn't felt before. The article had drawn a line in the sand, creating a public record that couldn't be disputed or rewritten. My mother could no longer tell her version of events unchallenged. The truth, complete with documentation and third-party corroboration, existed in permanent form. Anyone curious enough to search my name would find Jennifer's article before they found my mother's social media posts, and the article's credibility would outweigh any vague insinuations she might continue to make. I spent more time at the Redwood Crest House that summer, hosting the environmental nonprofit retreats that had become a regular feature, and also just enjoying the space for myself. I'd built a small deck off the back of the house overlooking the ocean, a project my grandfather had always talked about but never undertaken, and I spent countless evenings there with a book and a glass of wine, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The house had fully become mine in a way that went beyond legal ownership, imprinted with my choices and my energy, while still honoring the foundation my grandparents had built. One August afternoon, as I was working in the garden, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I stood up, shading my eyes against the sun, and saw a vehicle I didn't recognize. For a moment, old anxiety flared, wondering if this was some new attempt by my family to intrude on my peace. But the woman who emerged from the car was elderly, probably in her 70s, and her expression was uncertain rather than aggressive. She introduced herself as Dorothy Chan, explaining that she'd been a close friend of my grandmother's during the years before she'd moved to Pine Haven Gardens. Dorothy had read Jennifer's article and had been moved to reach out, wanting to share some memories of my grandmother that she thought I might appreciate. We sat on the porch for hours as Dorothy told stories I'd never heard, about my grandmother's early years as a teacher, her love of poetry, her quiet strength during difficult times in her marriage. Dorothy also shared that my grandmother had spoken about me often, always with pride and affection, noting how grateful she was that at least one grandchild had made time for what she called real relationship rather than obligatory visits. Before Dorothy left, she handed me a small box. She explained that my grandmother had given it to her years ago, asking her to hold on to it until the right moment. Inside was a leather journal filled with my grandmother's handwriting, entries spanning several years but focusing particularly on the period when her health had begun to decline. I read it that night, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. She documented my visits, the conversations we'd had, the small acts of care I'd provided. She'd also written about her decision to leave everything to me, her reasoning detailed and thoughtful, anticipating that there might be conflict and wanting to leave a record of her intentions. One entry, dated 3 months before she passed, struck me particularly hard. She'd written, "Maya doesn't know yet what we're planning to leave her, and I suspect she'd protest if she did. She's never asked for anything, never expected anything, just given freely of her time and heart. That's how I know she's the right person to receive this inheritance. She'll honor it not because she has to but because that's who she is. The others would see it as something owed to them, but Maya will see it as something to steward. That distinction matters more than any amount of money." Reading her words, I finally understood that the inheritance had never been primarily about the money or even the house. It had been about trust, about my grandmother's belief that I would carry forward the values she and my grandfather had lived by. The resources were tools, but the real gift was the faith she'd placed in me. And in fighting to protect that inheritance, I hadn't been defending my right to wealth. I'd been defending her right to make that choice, to have her final wishes honored rather than overridden by people who'd never valued her enough to show up when it mattered. I added my grandmother's journal to the fireproof safe where I kept the important documents, but I also made a digital copy that I read often when I needed perspective or strength. Her voice, preserved in ink, became a touchstone during moments when I questioned my choices or wondered if I'd been too harsh in cutting off my family. The journal reminded me that I'd been seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered, and that being seen was worth more than any amount of social approval from people who'd never bothered to look. Fall arrived with its annual reminder of transitions and change, and I found myself reflecting on how much had shifted in the 2 years since my graduation. I'd gone from hoping for crumbs of my family's attention to building a life that didn't require their validation. I'd inherited not just money and property, but also the example of people who'd chosen substance over performance, connection over appearance. And I'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes loving yourself means disappointing people who've never loved you properly in return. The Redwood Crest House hosted its first Thanksgiving that year, not with my biological family but with a chosen family I'd assembled. Aunt Lucia came, along with several cousins who'd maintained contact after the article's publication. I invited Dorothy Chan and some of the neighbors who'd welcomed me into the community. Rachel attended with her partner, and Vincent Marsh even made an appearance, joking that he usually avoided clients' personal events but was willing to make an exception for someone who'd actually listened to his legal advice and avoided a disastrous court battle. We gathered around the table my grandparents had used for decades, now expanded with additional leaves to accommodate the crowd. The food was abundant, the conversation was genuine, and the atmosphere was free of the tension that had characterized every family holiday I could remember. No one made passive-aggressive comments about life choices. No one compared accomplishments or subtly suggested someone else was doing better. We simply enjoyed each other's company, celebrated the year's blessings, and honored the connections we'd chosen to maintain. As I looked around the table, I realized this was what my grandparents had tried to teach me all along. Family wasn't defined by blood or obligation, but by mutual care and respect. The people gathered in their home that evening had earned their places through consistent presence and genuine support. They'd shown up not because they expected something in return, but because that's what you do for people you value. And in return, I'd opened my life and my home to them, creating the kind of community my grandparents would have celebrated. The inheritance had given me many things over the past 2 years: security and opportunity, and the freedom to make choices based on values rather than desperation. But perhaps the most valuable gift had been clarity. The conflict with my family had forced me to examine every relationship in my life, to distinguish between connection and convention, between love and leverage. I'd learned to trust my own judgment about who deserved access to my time, my energy, and my heart. And I'd learned that protecting those boundaries wasn't selfish or cold. It was the necessary work of building a life worth living. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Aunt Lucia helped me clear dishes in the kitchen. She paused in the middle of rinsing a plate and turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," she said quietly. "Not just because you kept the house or managed the money well, but because you've turned this place into exactly what she hoped it would be. A home, not a museum. A gathering place for people who matter. That's the real inheritance, Maya. Everything else is just resources." I hugged her tightly, my own eyes blurring with tears, and knew she was right. The house, the investments, the financial security, all of it was meaningful only insofar as it enabled me to live according to principles my grandparents had modeled. Generosity without depletion. Boundaries without cruelty. Care without expectation of return. These were the values worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth building a life around. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I walked out to the deck I'd built and looked up at the stars. The ocean was calm, just a gentle rhythm of waves reaching the shore and retreating. The air smelled of salt and roses, and somewhere in the distance a foghorn sounded its lonely warning. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From those empty seats at graduation to this moment of peaceful solitude in a home I'd earned the right to call my own. I'd lost a family I'd been born into, but I'd gained something more valuable in return. I'd gained myself, whole and uncompromised, no longer willing to diminish my worth for the comfort of people who'd never appreciated it. I'd gained clarity about what I would and wouldn't accept in relationships, what I would and wouldn't sacrifice for the sake of false harmony. And I'd gained the knowledge that I could stand alone when necessary, that I was strong enough to face opposition and strategic enough to protect what mattered. The future stretched before me with possibilities I was still discovering. The solar panel project was expanding nationally. The scholarship fund was growing. The house was becoming a hub for environmental advocacy and community building. Each of these represented a choice to use the inheritance in ways that created ripples beyond myself, that honored my grandparents' legacy by extending it into spaces and causes they would have valued. This was what it meant to be a good steward, not hoarding resources but deploying them thoughtfully toward purposes that mattered. I stayed on the deck until the cold drove me inside, then locked up the house and climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd claimed as my own. The room overlooked the ocean, and I'd woken many mornings to the sight of sun rising over water, light spreading across the horizon in shades of pink and gold. It never got old, that daily reminder of beauty and constancy, of natural rhythms that continued regardless of human drama and conflict. As I settled into bed, I thought about something my grandfather had told me years ago, during one of our conversations on the porch swing. He'd been talking about the oak tree in their front yard, how it had been struck by lightning once but had survived, its trunk scarred but its roots deep and strong. He'd said that's what resilience really means. Not avoiding damage but surviving it, and continuing to grow despite the scars. I understood that now in a way I hadn't then. The inheritance battle had scarred me, changing my relationships and my perspective in ways that could never be undone. But the damage hadn't destroyed me. Instead, it had forced me to develop deeper roots, to find strength in places I hadn't known to look, to grow in directions I might never have explored if everything had been easy and harmonious. The scars were real, but so was the growth they'd prompted. Sleep came easily that night, untroubled by anxiety or second-guessing. I'd made my choices, defended my boundaries, and built something worth protecting. The work wasn't finished, it never really is, but I was no longer afraid of the challenges ahead. I'd faced down the worst my family could throw at me and had emerged intact, stronger even, with a clearer sense of who I was and what I valued. That knowledge was its own kind of inheritance, one that would serve me long after the money was spent and the house eventually passed to whatever future I decided for it. The morning would bring new opportunities and new challenges, but for tonight, I rested in the home my grandparents had loved, surrounded by evidence that I'd honored their choice and their trust. And that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.